Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Seheult. Over the past 4 years, we've produced top quality videos explaining concepts in medicine clearly. These courses are the product of years of experience and preparation that includes only these things. Number one, you either need to know it for the test, or number two, you need to know it to become a great medical professional.
Hi, this is John Cullen. Welcome to another episode of Heroes of the Pandemic. Allow me to introduce you guys to Dr. Roger Seheult. And Dr. Roger, could you say hello to everybody if you would?
Hello, everyone.
There we go.
Thanks, John.
You bet. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you here. I'm just absolutely blown away by the work that you've done at MedCram. You're board certified in 4 different areas of medicine. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were a chem and a bio major. You did a fellowship in pulmonary care and critical care. And so I just can't imagine anybody who's more qualified to be talking about what we're going through right now. But for the audience that may not be familiar with your work with MedCram, first of all, you've got medcram.com, and you have the YouTube channel for MedCram. And the YouTube channel recently crossed 1 million subscribers. Is that right?
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So the reason I love what you do is probably in the subtlety of it. For the audience, what Dr. Seheult has done, before you did this, you used to teach the medical test. You used to teach aspiring doctors how to take the medical examinations and pass and become physicians, right? I mean, you did that as a career at one point, and now with these videos that you're doing, you're sort of distilling it down to the essence of what people need to know in a manner that's understandable. And I think that's the key differentiating element, is you've done this in a way that people can understand.
Before I became a physician, I worked for a national test prep company, and I taught the MCAT and the USMLE. Now, I'm board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, and sleep medicine. I still have a busy clinical practice and actually treat the diseases that I talk about. It is this experience that separates MedCram.com from all the others. I know what kind of questions show up on the test because I write the test questions for medical students. I know what's important, and now you will too. Join us at MedCram.com.
And I think it's allowed people to become physicians that may have struggled otherwise, because it's tough in the classroom often to understand the teaching assistants and what have you. And so I think that you may have helped a lot of people who have become great physicians become physicians. And for that, I think we're all grateful to you. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, this all started out back in about 2012. I had a physician assistant student named Kyle Allred who teamed up with me. He was actually my student, and he said to me, Dr. Schwell, people, medical students, PA students, those are physician assistants, respiratory therapists, all of these students that go into the medical field, they don't do what you did when you were in medical school. They don't go to the library and check out a journal article and have a library card and photocopy it and take it home. They go to Google, they go to YouTube, and they try to find the shortest video they can on a topic and watch that to get as much information as they can. And he's right. That's we probably would have done that if we had Google and YouTube back when I went into medical school. That was back in the late 90s. So what we did was we just basically made these videos, these instructional videos for students, medical students, PA students, respiratory therapy students, to learn. And it was the same material over and over again. They would come every month and we would discuss it. And so instead of spending the time to go over the same thing over and over, we just made these videos on YouTube, and they would watch these before they would come to the clinic. And then we would go over it. It's called a flipping the classroom type of thing, where instead of going to a lecture first and then going home and studying about it, you study about something before you come to lecture, and then you can fine tune that when you're actually meeting the professor one-on-one. So we did that. It was fairly successful. We had about 400,000 subscribers prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And, we had done videos before on Zika virus and things that were hot in the news. But about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, we decided to do our first coronavirus video, and it just exploded, and our subscriber base just exploded. And so what it was is, instead of making videos that were for a audience of medical professionals or people studying to go into the medical profession, we quickly realized that our audience now had expanded to those that were not familiar with the language of medicine. And it's one of the first things you learn when you go to medical school or these kind of schools is it's a different language. And so we had to learn to kind of expand out and use language that everybody could understand. And realized that we had a much bigger audience. And so it was kind of ironic, where all of the sports stadiums were shutting down, all of the basketball stadiums, coliseums, all these things were shutting down, and the sports figures were no longer being watched. It was kind of like Revenge of the Nerds, right? It's like now, instead of the jocks being watched, it was all the nerds could now talk, and everyone was watching us, the people that were never popular in school, or, I'm kind of being hyperbolic here, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I talk about this often, that the big difference between me and LeBron James, besides his wealth, is that he can do this really well, right? He does this really well. And for that, he makes millions more than you. It's kind of weird, but continue. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, no. So it's like now the world was watching medicine, and we had never been in the spotlight before, and we never watched. And so you have people, for better or for worse, you have people like Fauci, you have the president of the United States, you have the health minister, you have Health and Human Services, you have drug companies, you have immunologists. People now, what they said really didn't matter before. It was kind of wonky. The people in that field and those echo chambers were listening to those people. But now you had hundreds of millions of people literally listening to these people. And what we saw, and we can get into this more, is what we saw was the science dictating what they did in most cases. And the problem with that is that the science changes. And so one day they would say one thing, and maybe a month or two later they would change their mind. And people who didn't understand this were looking at this and saying, they're waffling. It's not politics, it's medicine. And so medicine changes. And so for us in the world, we were like, well, I'd rather have somebody, kind of changing their mind, dictating as the science goes, rather than sticking to their previous idea, regardless of what the science says. And so there's a lot of interesting aspects about this whole pandemic and what's gone on in the last 12, 13 months. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, the thing that upset me dramatically, and I think upset my audience dramatically, was how professionals, how doctors and PhDs and practicing physicians, epidemiologists, if they had any sort of observation that they wanted to share, it seemed that the social media companies felt that it was their role to step in and say, that's not exactly what the CDC said, and so we're going to need to eliminate your channels. And I think there were a couple doctors in California, 2 doctors that were in a conference room, and they were saying, we're seeing this and we're seeing that, and it was like it was as if they were falsely accused of having some alternate agenda or something. And I think most of the world looks at it and says, these are just doctors telling you what they're seeing. I think everybody was sort of taken aback by this and wondering what the heck is going on. Why are they shutting down all the doctors? What's with this, hush thing? What is that?
It's real. It's happening even now, as you know. Back when we were at MedCram talking about hydroxychloroquine, even before it was political, we were talking about it in March even. And then when it became political, we had a number of our videos taken down. Bloomberg had some questions about it. When I say Bloomberg, the news service did a story, interviewed us, and went to, in this case, it was YouTube, and those videos were eventually reinstated. But even to this day, we've talked about vitamin D. Vitamin D is a pretty mainstream talk. There are scientists who believe that vitamin D may be beneficial in COVID-19. There's a number of articles and studies that actually have shown that vitamin D supplementation with vitamin D is beneficial in acute chest infections. That we have that.
Why would that be controversial? I mean, got milk, right? I mean, why would it be controversial to talk about certain levels of vitamin D? I mean, why? And
I get comments from people on our channel who said, "Hey, I tried to share your vitamin D video on Facebook, and I got banned for 24 hours."
Dr. Seheult, you've advocated for vitamin D as a potential way to prevent COVID-19 infections, to prevent severe COVID-19 infections.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So we've been talking about vitamin D as a potential therapeutic agent for COVID-19 since March. And since that time, a lot of other people have become involved in looking at that agent as well. A number of research studies have been done. And the purpose... Okay, so let's talk about vitamin D. The first thing you've got to understand is that vitamin D is not just a vitamin. Vitamin D is actually a hormone. And if you notice here by the structure, you'll see that it is a steroid hormone, which means it can go into the nucleus. It can go through membranes and make effective changes.
That's crazy. Well, to me, that's why you're a hero, right? So it's that and everything else that you did up until the coronavirus. And then to stick your neck out as you've done. I mean, one of the slide I have up now is Dr. Scott Jensen. And when Dr. Jensen came forward and said, this reimbursement thing is a little bit awkward as far as, motivations to admit patients. And they went after his license for coming out with that. And so that's why I'm doing this Heroes of the Pandemic, because I just can't stand for this ad hominem attacking of physicians. It's atrocious, and it needs to stop.
We're going to have a special guest in here in just a second, Dr. Scott Jensen. I saw his thread yesterday, his video, and I thought, oh my God, I must interview him. There's a lot to get into here.
My next guest is a doctor and state senator in Minnesota who is deeply troubled by the CDC's latest guidance for counting COVID deaths. Dr. Scott Jensen joins me now.
Well, I would remind him that anytime healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000, 3 times as much. Nobody can tell me after 35 years in the world of medicine that sometimes those kinds of things impact on what we do. Some physicians really have a bent towards public health, and they will put down influenza or whatever because that's their preference. I try to stay very specific, very precise. If I know I've got pneumonia, that's what's going on, the death certificate. I'm not going to add stuff just because it's convenient.
So I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. We've seen senators get shut down. We saw the former president get shut down. We've seen doctors get shut down. And all I'm going to do here is cite data from the CDC and the WHO. That's it. I don't have a theory. I don't subscribe to any theories. I just have data. That's it. You're the doctor, okay? And the data that I'm going to share with you mostly is coming from the CDC. I'm going to show you exactly where it comes from, but a bunch of other data is going to come from the WHO. But why don't I share with the audience a little bit about the agenda that we're going to cover in this show. So I guess one of the members of our mutual audience, so there's some intersection between my microscopic group of people that watch my audience and your million subscribers. And somebody said, Dr. Seheult is using the maps. He's using the maps. And I guess somebody sent you an email, one of my audience members, and reached out to you. And you and I had a little bit of email correspondence, but that's it. This is the first time we're meeting. And so you sent me a note and said, okay, what do we want to talk about? So let me just lay out the agenda for the audience so that they know what the expectations are. I sent you an email saying, well, how is it, first of all, that there's more people dead in Ohio than all of Japan? All right, so I tend to look at things a little bit differently, right? I come up with, I don't know if you're familiar with Freakonomics. All right, so I look at things in a...
My entire academic life has been devoted to figuring out tricky ways to get at causality.
We kind of say, what if this thing that everybody thinks is so really isn't so? It sounds ridiculous, but you see it all the time, people trying to fight against or build up something that they're sure is connected to something else, which it turns out just isn't.
The closest thing to worldview in Freakonomics is that incentives matter. And if you can figure out what people's incentives are, you have a good chance of guessing how they're going to behave.
They say money doesn't buy happiness. Wanna bet?
I don't have to ever have seen a sumo match. I can go in the data and I can tell you that there was rampant cheating going on.
When there's an incentive to cheat, a small percentage of people always will.
Could students increase their test scores simply by giving them a financial incentive?
$50. You are getting straight A's from me. Yes.
Clear the numbers are dropping. What's not clear is why.
The line between like economist and criminal is incredibly thin.
And what about journalists?
No line.
Oh, that is so cool.
You give people permission to challenge conventional wisdom and to ask a different kind of question entirely.
And I guess from reading their stuff, I just kind of learned to look at things differently. So I look at Ohio and I compare Ohio to Japan. I look at California and I compare California to the entire country of China, the entire country of Korea, the entire nation of Nigeria and Tanzania. And California has more dead. Now, these are not comparisons that I hear Anderson Cooper making. These are not comparisons that I hear on ABC News. Okay, so this is different. This is a different way of looking at this outbreak.
When I started my career in advertising, it was sort of on the heels of one of the most iconic campaigns in the ad game, which was the Think Different campaign that Apple put together. It talked about there's certain people that bucked convention, that did things different from the way that things were done. And because of their approach and the way that they thought differently, they were able to make some profound and fundamental changes. You can look at various behavior of some notable people in history. Albert Einstein, for example, even some historical figures like Mozart, recent figures like Amelia Earhart, even Steve Jobs. And they displayed some very classic behavior of people on the spectrum. I was reading a report that was published in the Journal of Autism and Development Disorders. It talks about how people on the spectrum are programmed to think differently. And they did a series of tests. They asked a number of people, I think there's a sampling of about 350 people, and they asked them to look at common things like paper clips and identify alternative uses for these common items. A neurotypical response to that question would have been things like a pin or a fish hook or a piece of jewelry. People on the spectrum gave answers like a ballast for a paper airplane or chips for gambling. And they found that their responses were less than 5% of the common responses of the whole sample size. So they were actually, quantitatively different. So people on the spectrum, the right side of the brain, the one that answers, as they say, for the creativity, for the common experiences, the more sort of social behavior, it's impaired. It's one of the reasons that they are the way that they are. There isn't really a social common behavior that they have. There aren't the same references that they share with people. So people on the spectrum, their left side, the more logic side, not only is it not impaired, because it's what they use more often, in some cases it tends to be more developed. And the theory that came out of this piece was people on the spectrum, they approach problem solving differently because that's the way that they're wired. I think many people remember the Think Different campaign. It talked about there's certain people that did things different from the way that things are done. And there was a 1-minute film basically celebrating that. They kind of went through and selected some iconic figures who, just through their sheer willpower or because they thought differently, changed humanity for the better. And it just so happens that many of these people that changed the face of humanity, that thought differently, were on the spectrum. As I said, including Steve Jobs, who is suspected to have had Asperger's. If you include the 18 people highlighted there, 13 of the 18 people were either diagnosed as being on the spectrum or suspected to have been on the spectrum, which is pretty amazing. And there was never a brief, at least I never read about a brief, that we're looking for people on the spectrum. They're looking for people that thought differently.
I look at comorbidities. What is the number one comorbidity? What if it was tuberculosis? As a pulmonary guy, you'd be like, what? Tuberculosis? What, are you kidding me? You mean we got a co-infection of tuberculosis? I mean, if it turned out it was something like that, or what if, 48% of the people had rotavirus? That would be kind of significant, right? You'd be like, what? How did that happen, right? You'd want to know that. So we want to look at, what is the number one comorbidity? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it diabetes? Is it something else? And then, I don't know if I'm even allowed to say the word anymore. Sex, right? The sex chromosome is what it's called, right? XX or XY. That's not a gender thing. You can be any gender you want. I'm talking about chromosomes, right? I'm all for gender fluidity. Anybody, it's all good with me. But we're talking about XX or XY. Right? And in an XXXY world, is there a difference? And if there was a difference, would you want to know about it? For example, hypothetically speaking, if twice as many women were dying as men from coronavirus, would that be relevant? Would we want to talk about that? Would we want to explore that further and understand the dynamic behind that, if that were the case? Right? And this, similarly, I guess, with race, right? If there were particular races.
We know Black people are disproportionately likely to contract the virus and die from
races that were dying at a 2-to-1 over some other race, right? If we found out that Asian Americans were dying at a prorated 2-to-1 ratio over everybody else, we'd want to know, well, why is that, right? Why is that happening? So when we look at deaths from other causes, the question becomes, well, where does COVID fit in the overall scenario of things killing different groups, right? And in particular, I've been looking at kids because of this issue of reopening the schools, right? So I ask, again, kind of uncomfortable, weird questions, which we'll get to. But, things like, I don't know, did more kids actually die from asthma than from coronavirus last year? Did more kids actually die from stroke than coronavirus last year? And if that's the case, why are we not putting that in perspective in a way that might make... So for example, I mentioned tuberculosis a minute ago. There is a vaccine for tuberculosis. I think it's called the GB... You're going to know this. You're a pulmonary guy. It's the Guillain-Barré something. It's some French name. GBC...
Yeah, it's the BCG vaccine.
There you go. There you go. The BCG vaccine. And they use it in a disadvantaged part of the world for tuberculosis, right? But why don't we use that in the United States? Why don't we vaccinate children in the United States with that vaccine? Why?
The reason is because, well, first of all, that vaccine does a very good job at preventing meningitis in young children. Meningitis from tuberculosis, that is. It doesn't do a very good job at all at preventing pulmonary tuberculosis. And it all has to do, it all has to do with prevalence. So if you look at those countries where they give the BCG vaccine, they usually have a high prevalence of tuberculosis. And so it's much more cost effective in those countries to vaccinate against the disease. In our country, fortunately, the United States, we don't have a very high prevalence of tuberculosis. And so it's much more cost effective to screen for the disease and then treat it when you find it. Now, the reason why that those are different is because when you get the BCG vaccine, it unfortunately renders your screening tool useless. So if you get a BCG vaccine, you can't do the skin test. It's going to be positive
no matter
regardless
what. Got it.
No matter what.
Got it.
Right.
Got
so we have to make a choice at the outset. If you want to do, you got to figure out, are you a high prevalence country or a low prevalence country? If you're a low prevalence country, it doesn't make any sense vaccinating. It makes a much better sense doing the screening.
Well, you just made my point. Thank you. So the question then becomes, where's the dividing line? How do we decide, right? And is it based on death? Is it based on, so for example, if I didn't know this meningitis thing, that the TB wasn't just pulmonary disaster, that it also had a meningitis component, I guess, or outcome that could be bad. So these factors that go into deciding where the vaccine will be used, in what countries are going to use it and what countries won't. The United States at some point said, there's not that many kids, I guess, that are dying. For me, that's the litmus test, is dying, right? Now, if it has permanent, if there's permanent stuff, like if you get meningitis and then you're disabled, I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you recover from meningitis without any kind of side effects, or?
Yeah, well, once you get, unfortunately, if you get meningitis, which is a rare complication, you can get some permanent problems. The real issue with tuberculosis, and the reason why they nail that one down hard in terms of screening, and they're very particular about it, especially where I live here in California, is because it can spread. It's an infectious, it's a communicable disease. Sure. It can spread to others. And so making sure that you catch an outbreak quickly, early, and make sure you treat it. Treating is another complication, because if you don't treat it appropriately, all you'll do is just make it resistant to the medicines you're giving it.
And it's complicated. Treating pulmonary tuberculosis, I think there's like 3 or 4 different medications, and it's not stuff most people have heard of. It's not Zithromax. I mean, it's complex stuff, right? You're
absolutely right. Yeah, 4 drugs typically.
I mean, that's and it's a regimen that lasts for quite some time, right? It's not a 5-day regimen. It's months.
Yeah.
And over 1 million people are dying from tuberculosis annually, like 3,000 a day, something like that.
Right, and the real problem is that the real thing that the WHO is concerned about is the not just tuberculosis. It's the drug-resistant tuberculosis that's the real key, and it's the problem. And where are we seeing it? We're seeing it in countries that had lost their public health departments during the fall of communism. So Eastern Europe is a hotbed, or was a hotbed, of drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Interesting. Well, with that as a background for our agenda, let me sort of introduce myself to you and give you some perspective as to where am I coming from with this thing. You know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a data guy. And over 30 years ago, while I was working at Oracle, there's a company in California that said, we want to take maps and marry them to the database. And I was the guy that went out there to do it. And I put the team together to do this. And this is over 30 years ago. So when I saw how Johns Hopkins was using my map, I said, what are you doing? That's not how you use it. What are you doing here? Something's wrong. And I became a whistleblower, and I didn't sign up for this. I didn't have a YouTube channel looking into diseases. I wasn't doing maps. I was doing other kind of investigative journalism, but this wasn't my wheelhouse at all. And then I saw the map, and I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? So I'm going to show you what I discovered as a result of being a data expert, a database expert, and a cartographer. I'm a mapping expert, okay? And I don't think they were counting on someone with my skill set to come along and look at this the way we're about to look at it. Also, I am of the belief that the FDA is not 100% perfect all the time. They've made one or two mistakes along the way, right? Zantac, right? Accutane, right? Thalidomide. I mean, we've had a number of disasters along the way. So they're not perfect. An adult conversation, I mean, that's really all this is. We're just going to talk about stuff. I was prescribed Zantac and took it for some time, right? Now, am I going to die from stomach cancer because of that? Because someone made a mistake? I don't know, right? But, right, this was pulled off the market and I was prescribed it, right? So I'm not allowed to ask questions about the medications that I'm being prescribed, right? It should be reasonable. So the kinds of questions that I've been asking are these really annoying questions like, how is it, Governor Newsom, that California has more people dead than 13 of the 20 most populated countries on the planet, including China? That's a pretty awkward question for Governor Newsom. In fact, he may not be able to bear more questions because that's a really uncomfortable question. So California has more people dead than 13 of the 20 most populated countries on Earth. That's not good.